Johnny Carson had done thousands of interviews in his lifetime, presidents, movie stars, legends. But on the night of November 14th, 1977, he asked one single question, and what he saw in Frank Sinatra's eyes made him, for the first time in his 30-year career, completely freeze. Sinatra leaned slightly forward in his chair, looked directly into Johnny's eyes, and whispered loud enough for the 300 people in the studio and 25 million Americans watching at home to hear, "Johnny, don't ever say that name again." The studio turned to ice. Bandleader Doc Severinsen dropped his baton. Ed McMahon's face went white as a sheet. That night, Johnny Carson came face to face with the most dangerous man in television history. But here's what most people don't know. What happened in the next 47 minutes would test the limits of their 20-year friendship, reveal secrets about Sinatra that he had kept hidden from the world, and change the way Johnny Carson approached every interview for the rest of his career. To understand what really happened that night, we need to go back. Back to 1957, when a young comedian from Nebraska first met the chairman of the board. Johnny Carson was nobody in 1957. He was hosting a daytime game show called Who Do You Trust? And dreaming of bigger things. Frank Sinatra, on the other hand, was everything. He had survived the career collapse of the early 50s, won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity, and clawed his way back to the top of the entertainment world. They met at a party in Los Angeles. Dean Martin introduced them. Johnny was starstruck. Frank was Frank, charming when he wanted to be, terrifying when he didn't. "Kid," Sinatra said to Johnny that night, "you've got good timing. That's the only thing that matters in this business. Timing and knowing when to shut up." Johnny never forgot that advice. Over the next 2 decades, their friendship grew, but it was never an equal friendship. Nobody was equal to Frank Sinatra. You were either useful to him or you weren't. And Johnny Carson, as he rose to become the king of late night, became very useful indeed. They gambled together in Vegas. They drank together at Sinatra's compound in Palm Springs. They attended each other's weddings, all 4 of Frank's and 3 of Johnny's. On the surface, they were the best of friends, but Johnny knew the rules. Everyone who was close to Sinatra knew the rules. Rule number 1, never ask about the rumors. Now, I need to pause here and explain something. By 1977, Frank Sinatra had been followed by rumors for over 30 years. Rumors about his connections to organized crime, rumors about his friendships with men whose names appeared in FBI files, rumors about what happened to people who crossed him. Were they true? Nobody knew for certain. And more importantly, nobody dared to ask. Journalists who got too curious found their careers suddenly stalled. Photographers who took unflattering pictures found their cameras mysteriously broken. There were whispers, always whispers, but never proof. Frank Sinatra existed in a space between celebrity and something darker. He was untouchable, and he liked it that way. Johnny Carson knew all of this. He had heard the stories at those parties in Palm Springs. He had seen how other men, powerful men, deferred to Frank. He understood that his friendship with Sinatra came with unwritten rules. And for 20 years, Johnny Carson followed those rules perfectly. Until November 14th, 1977, The Tonight Show that evening had been going smoothly. Frank was promoting his latest album, and he was in a good mood. He told stories about recording with Count Basie. He joked about Dean Martin's drinking. The audience was loving it. Then Johnny made a mistake. It wasn't intentional. Years later, Johnny would insist it was just a slip, a momentary lapse in judgment. But in that moment, he asked about something he should never have mentioned. "Frank," Johnny said casually, "I read somewhere that you and Sam Giancana used to be close. Any truth to that?" Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss. The man rumored to have helped John F. Kennedy win the 1960 election. The man who had been murdered, shot 7 times in the face, just 2 years earlier in 1975. The moment Johnny said that name, everything changed. The studio audience didn't understand what was happening. To them, it was just a question about an old news story. But the people who knew, the producers backstage, Ed McMahon at his desk, the veteran crew members who had been around long enough to understand the rules, they all held their breath. Frank Sinatra's smile disappeared. Not slowly, not gradually. It vanished, like someone had flipped a switch. "Johnny." Frank's voice was quiet. Too quiet. Don't ever say that name again." The silence that followed lasted 8 seconds. 8 seconds doesn't sound like much. Try counting it out right now. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. 8 seconds of absolute silence on live television is an eternity. Here's what the cameras didn't show. During those 8 seconds, producer Fred de Cordova was backstage, his hand hovering over the button that would cut to commercial. He was sweating. Everyone was sweating. But Johnny Carson did something remarkable, something that proved why he was the greatest talk show host who ever lived. He didn't apologize. He didn't backtrack. He didn't try to laugh it off. He simply nodded once, very slowly, and said, "Fair enough, Frank. Let's talk about the album." And just like that, the moment passed. Frank's smile returned. The interview continued. To the average viewer at home, it probably seemed like nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. Something significant. The two men who had been friends for 20 years had just established in front of 25 million witnesses exactly where the line was. Johnny had crossed it, Frank had pushed him back, and neither of them would ever forget it. The show ended normally. Frank sang a song, the audience applauded, and the credits rolled. But backstage, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Johnny went to Frank's dressing room. What happened there, only two people ever knew. But according to one production assistant who was walking past the closed door, he heard Johnny's voice say, "Frank, I'm sorry. It won't happen again." And Frank's voice, calm but cold, replied, "I know it won't." They remained friends after that night. But people who knew them both said something had changed. There was a distance that hadn't been there before, a wariness. Johnny never mentioned Sam Giancana again. Not on the show, not in interviews, not even in his private conversations with close friends. That name had become a ghost that he refused to acknowledge. In 1991, 1 year before Johnny retired from The Tonight Show, he sat down for a rare private interview with a journalist he trusted. The conversation was off the record, meant to be published only after Johnny's death. The journalist asked about Sinatra. Johnny was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that reveals just how deeply that night had affected him. "Frank was my friend," Johnny said, "but there was always a part of Frank that scared me. Not because I thought he would physically hurt me, but because I understood that Frank lived in a world where certain things were possible that weren't possible for the rest of us." He paused. That night in 1977, when I asked that stupid question, I saw something in Frank's eyes. I saw a man who had survived things I couldn't imagine, who had done things I didn't want to know about, and who was warning me as a friend not to go down that road. The journalist pressed him. Did Johnny believe the rumors about Sinatra and organized crime? Johnny's answer was careful. "I believe Frank was a complicated man who lived in complicated times. I believe he knew people that most of us only read about in newspapers, and I believe that whatever he did or didn't do, he had his reasons." He smiled sadly. "But I also believe that Frank Sinatra was the greatest entertainer of his generation. And sometimes that has to be enough." Now here's where this story gets really interesting, because in the decades since that night, we've learned a lot more about Frank Sinatra's connections. FBI files released after Sinatra's death in 1998 revealed that the Bureau had been investigating him since the 1940s. They documented meetings with known mob figures. They tracked his movements. They intercepted his phone calls. Did they ever prove that Frank Sinatra was a member of organized crime? No. But they proved something almost as significant. Frank Sinatra moved through a world that most Americans could never understand. He was friends with presidents and mob bosses. He dined with movie stars and men who made people disappear. He existed in the gray area between legitimate success and something darker. And he was brilliant enough, talented enough, and yes, intimidating enough to never be held accountable for any of it. Johnny Carson understood this. Maybe not consciously, but instinctively. And that's why on November 14th, 1977, when Frank Sinatra looked at him with those ice-cold eyes, Johnny knew exactly what was being communicated. This is where the line is. Don't cross it again. Frank Sinatra appeared on The Tonight Show several more times after 1977. Each time, the interview was friendly, professional, and completely surface level. Johnny never asked another dangerous question. Frank never had to issue another warning. But in May 1992, something different happened. Johnny Carson was retiring. After 30 years as the king of late night, he was walking away. And for his final weeks of shows, he invited back the guests who had meant the most to him over the years. Frank Sinatra, now 76 years old and showing his age, came on the show one last time. The interview was nostalgic. They talked about the old days, about Vegas in the 60s, about all the legendary moments they had shared. The audience loved it. But at the end of the interview, Frank did something unexpected. He leaned over, put his hand on Johnny's arm and said, "Johnny, you've been a good friend, through everything. I want you to know that." It was a simple statement, but coming from Frank Sinatra, a man who never expressed sentimentality publicly, it meant everything. Johnny's eyes welled up with tears. "Frank," he said, his voice rough, "it's been an honor." They shook hands, and then Frank Sinatra walked off the Tonight Show stage for the last time. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, 6 years after Johnny's retirement. Johnny didn't attend the funeral. His health was failing by then, and traveling was difficult, but he sent flowers and a private note to Frank's widow, Barbara. The contents of that note have never been revealed. Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005. In his personal effects, his family found a photograph from the 1970s, Frank and Johnny, arm in arm, laughing at some party in Palm Springs. On the back, in Frank's handwriting, were the words, "To Johnny, you know when to shut up. That's why we're friends." Johnny had kept that photograph for over 30 years. So what do we make of this story? What does that night in November 1977 tell us about fame, friendship, and the lines we draw in our lives? Maybe it tells us that even the most powerful friendships have boundaries. Maybe it tells us that some questions are better left unasked. Or maybe it tells us something simpler, that Frank Sinatra and Johnny Carson were two men who understood each other perfectly. They both knew that in the world of entertainment, image is everything, and they both knew that some truths are too dangerous to speak out loud. Johnny crossed a line that night. Frank pushed him back, and then, like true professionals, they continued the show. Because in the end, the show must always go on. Frank Sinatra once said, "The best revenge is massive success." He lived by those words. He survived scandals, career collapses, failed marriages, and FBI investigations. Through it all, he remained the chairman of the board. Johnny Carson once said, "Talent alone won't make you a success. Neither will being in the right place at the right time. The key is to keep playing the game long enough to get lucky." He lived by those words too. He navigated 30 years of live television, survived countless controversies, and retired as the undisputed king of late night. Two men, two philosophies, one complicated friendship, and one night in November 1977 when the whole world saw, just for a moment, what happened when those two worlds collided. If this story gave you a new perspective on these two legends, hit that subscribe button, share it with someone who loves the golden age of television, and drop a comment telling me which classic celebrity friendship you'd like to learn more about. Because behind every famous smile, there's a story most people never hear. Until next time.